Our discussion about the Declaration of Independence is going to begin with something that sounds really, really boring. But in fact, the British Tax Acts that Great Britain imposed upon the colonies between 1764 and 1783 are not only essential in understanding the path to independence, but were also quite scandalous at the time, and therefore maybe not so boring after all. The British provided significant support to the colonies during the French and Indian War. In fact, King George III thought this support so significant that as soon as the war was over, he began to tax the colonies for imported goods that the colonies couldn't otherwise produce themselves. It all started with the Sugar Act in 1764, which didn't just create a tax on sugar, but all imported goods that the colonists bought. Now you have to remember these people are being taxed by a government in which they have no representation at the time. So the colonists were upset that they had to pay tax to a king who oversaw a government where they weren't even represented. They didn't even have a say. There were a lot of products that the colonists just couldn't make or grow themselves at the time. A lot of these products were things like sugar, molasses, paper, glass, lead, paint, tea. All of these imported products that the colonists bought now had a new tax on them. By the time 1773 rolled around, the colonists had been taxed off and on for different products. And a new tax would come along and then it would be repealed. But the one tax that was never repealed since 1764 was tea, the tax on tea. So in 1773, the colonists had been paying tax on tea for almost 10 years, and I cannot emphasize enough how important tea was at the time. I mean, these were former British people. This is a staple to not only their diet, but their lifestyle. It really didn't matter if you were rich or poor, young or old, everybody drank tea. Prior to the Tea Act of 1773, the British East India Company would sell its tea to colonial tea merchants who would in turn take the tea back with them to the colonies and sell it to merchants there. Well, the Tax Act allowed the British East India Company to skip the colonial merchants in the middle altogether and sell their tea directly to the colonies at a cheaper price. Rather than just accept an act of parliament that was passed without any representatives to vote on behalf of the 13 colonies, many colonists boycotted British tea altogether in favor of tea that was either smuggled in by the Dutch or grown elsewhere. Meanwhile, the very well-connected British East India Company had a surplus of millions of pounds of tea just sitting there in storage, rotting away. So to avoid going out of business, they sent ships full of tea to Boston Harbor, where the British government had appointed Thomas Gage as the royal governor of Massachusetts in an attempt to force colonial merchants to buy the tea. It didn't work. Instead, in protest against the British, a group called the Sons of Liberty got together in the Boston Harbor in December 1773, boarded a ship loaded with tea, and dumped 342 chests of the stuff into the harbor. This act of defiance became known throughout the colonies as the Boston Tea Party, an event that would serve as a symbol of the widely held colonial proclamation: no taxation without representation. British backlash came in the form of the Intolerable Acts of 1774, known in Britain as the Coercive Acts. They were 5 acts passed by British Parliament that triggered the Revolutionary War and eventually independence from Britain. The acts created martial law throughout Massachusetts and closed the port in Boston until the colonists paid for the damages incurred by the Boston Tea Party. It also mandated the quartering of British soldiers by colonial households. Anytime a British soldier wanted to enter a colonial household and hang out or shack up, they could do so without permission by the homeowner. Imagine the terror that this produced. Martial law was imposed on Massachusetts. While the colonies had always been under British rule officially, in practice, they had ruled themselves for over a century. In the case of Massachusetts, it had been making its own laws and governing itself for over 150 years. And then, just like that, they were under martial law. Just a few months later, the First Continental Congress convened in September 1774. It was attended by 12 of the 13 colonies. Georgia, the youngest colony, wouldn't attend until the following year. The attendees really were not interested in talking about independence at the time. They were more concerned with petitioning King George III to hear their grievances and to expand further upon existing boycotts of all things British. They did this in a written declaration known as the Suffolk Resolves. There were a few delegates who still felt a glimmer of loyalty toward the British Empire. So when drafting the declaration, these loyalists made an effort to temper the language of the more rebellious patriots in the group. This didn't matter. An enraged third considered the Suffolk Resolves to be a blatant act of rebellion. In retaliation, the American Prohibitory Act was passed by Parliament in response to the petition. The act was basically a tit-for-tat response that countered the colonies' boycotts of British goods with similar boycotts of American goods. Before long, an increasing number of British soldiers appeared throughout the colonies, followed by outbreaks of conflict, beginning with the Battle of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. The independence of the colonies had yet to be officially declared, yet the Revolutionary War was on. The Battle of Lexington and Concord was fought only a month prior to the Second Continental Congress, so it was still fresh in the minds of the delegates when they met. And the next battle was only days away. That June, the following month, in 1775, following the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Continental Army was officially authorized, with George Washington as its commander-in-chief. By January 1776, the Intolerable Acts and the Revolutionary War prompted chatter among the colonists about independence. On January 10th, a new book about egalitarian government, written by an anonymous author, at the time anyway, appeared in colonial bookstores. The book was titled Common Sense, and it was an instant hit. Its author, who we now know was Thomas Paine, wrote in a clear and persuasive language aimed toward common, average colonists who made up the majority of the population. Here is an excerpt. A government of our own is our natural right. And when a man seriously reflects on the precariousness of human affairs, he will become convinced that it is infinitely wiser and safer to form a constitution of our own in a cool and deliberate manner while we have it in our power than to trust such an interesting event to time and chance. Nothing can settle our affairs so expeditiously as an open and determined declaration for independence. These ideas were not new. They were the topic of many a tavern debate and had been that way for quite a few years throughout the colonies. It was just that Paine had a way of saying these things that was new, and most importantly, Paine's words were motivating. The arguments contained in Common Sense were just that, common sense about common problems experienced by common people who had never been afforded the opportunity to make choices about the type of government that ruled them. Yet they were the first to volunteer their sons and their guns to the war effort. In fact, colonies didn't have any money to pay soldiers fighting the war being fought at the time. Instead, soldiers grabbed their own firearms, if they owned them, and took to the field. They ponied up their own resources to fight against the British. And for what? For years, soldiers were paid little more than IOUs. Before long, they were losing everything they had worked for. Banks were foreclosing on their property because they wouldn't honor the IOUs as money. Paine's arguments were logical, and they struck the hearts and minds of the patriots, sacrificing life and their own property, something they were willing to do if they could just have some role in whatever government that was going to rule them. But before a new government could be officially formed, independence from Britain must be officially declared. And you could bet that writings by people like Paine and John Locke would have an influence on that Declaration of Independence. And boy, did it ever.